Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to we're diving into a story, and it's got some twists and turns, right? We're talking about a Senate candidate, a war wound, and a whole bunch of conflicting accounts. So, are you ready to do some digging?
Absolutely. This is a perfect example of how a story that seems pretty simple on the surface can get really complicated really fast, especially when you bring in things like, memory, politics, and someone's reputation.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into it. Our main player today is Tim Sheehy, former Navy SEAL, now running for Senate in Montana. He's up against the incumbent, John Tester. Now, Sheehy has said a few times that he got a bullet wound in his right arm while he was serving in Afghanistan. Seems straightforward enough, right?
Well, yeah, you'd think so. But here's where things take a turn. When you're in the public eye like that, making these kinds of claims, it's going to attract attention, right? People tend to have very strong ideas about military service, heroism, that sort of thing. So when there are inconsistencies, well, people start to notice.
And boy, are there inconsistencies in this story. Okay, so get this. 3 years after Sheehy comes back from his deployment in 2012, he tells the police, this is 2015, that he accidentally shot himself in the arm after a hike
Hmm.
in Glacier National Park.
Wow.
And that, according to him at the time, is where that bullet wound came from.
Okay, so now we've got two completely different stories about the same injury. This is where we have to start looking really closely at who's saying what. We have to think about things like credibility, their motivations, all of that.
And we've got another player in all of this, a park ranger, Kim Peach. He actually talked to Sheehy at the hospital back in 2015. Peach had told the New York Times, and this is a direct quote, "I am 100% sure he shot himself that day."
Wow, that's pretty definitive.
Right. But there's more. Peach actually took Sheehy's revolver, and guess what he found? 5 live rounds and 1 spent casing.
Well, that seems like pretty compelling evidence.
It does, doesn't it? But hold on tight, because it's about to get even more complicated.
Oh boy, really?
Oh, yeah. So Sheehy and his lawyers, they're now saying that, well, he lied to the park ranger to protect his platoon mates.
To protect them how?
They're claiming that the bullet wound actually happened because of friendly fire in Afghanistan, and that when he fell while he was hiking, it just, like, aggravated the old wound and made it look fresh.
Okay, I mean, it's not unheard of to want to protect your buddies, but this raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? I mean, why lie about an accidental shooting? And another thing, one of his former SEAL colleagues, Dave Madden, he made a good point. Why would you try to hide a friendly fire incident? That kind of thing is really common on the battlefield.
Exactly. Madden actually spoke to the New York Times, and he said that Sheehy never, not once, mentioned a gunshot wound to him. And they were pretty close, even sharing war stories and all that.
Interesting.
Right. And it gets even more interesting because now 2 other former SEALs have come forward saying that they remember Sheehy being injured, but not by a gunshot. They say it was an IED.
So we've got multiple accounts from people who served with Sheehy, and they're directly contradicting this central part of his story.
Exactly. So we've got a Senate candidate claiming a war injury, a park ranger with what looks like evidence of a completely different story, and now former comrades saying, hold on a minute, this just doesn't add up. It's a lot to unravel, Rady.
It is, and it's here that we really can't ignore the political context. I mean, this isn't just some personal story playing out, right? We're talking about a very tightly contested Senate race.
Right, and it gets even trickier because, if I'm remembering the polls correctly, Sheehy's actually got a slight edge over Tester right now in this Senate race.
Which brings us to another layer in all of this. Sheehy's lawyers are now suggesting that Madden, his old SEAL buddy, well, that he's politically motivated. Madden's a registered Democrat, and they're basically implying that he's trying to sabotage Sheehy's campaign. Yeah, that's something you see a lot in these situations, right? When accusations start flying around, especially in a close election, everyone wants to discredit the other side. But we have to remember, someone's political affiliation doesn't automatically mean their claims are false.
Exactly. So how do we, as voters, try to make sense of all this? What should we be focusing on when we're trying to figure out what happened and why it matters?
Well, for me, this whole thing really underscores the power of storytelling, right? But also the limitations of memory, especially when you're dealing with something like military service, which is so emotionally charged. We tend to have these kind of idealized versions of heroism and what it means to serve, but the reality is always more complex.
Right. It's like that old saying, there are 3 sides to every story. Your side, my side, and the truth. And sometimes it feels like the truth is the hardest one to find.
Exactly. That's why this case is so fascinating, don't you think? It's a real exercise in critical thinking. We can't just accept everything we hear at face value, especially when it sounds a little too convenient, or maybe too outlandish to be true. We have to really look at the evidence, consider different points of view, and accept that maybe, just maybe, things aren't as simple as they seem.
Which, let's face it, is a lot harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
Especially these days. It seems like we're just drowning in information coming from every direction. How can we even begin to sift through it all?
It's more important now than ever to really cultivate those critical thinking skills, because this case isn't just about one Senate candidate or a disputed war wound. It's about how we, as a society, evaluate information, especially when it gets mixed up with political agendas and how the media presents a story.
So where does that leave us, the voters? How do we make these decisions, especially with an election coming up, when we're faced with these conflicting stories and the possibility of misinformation?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. I think it starts by recognizing that nobody has a monopoly on the truth. The media doesn't, political parties don't, and even personal accounts can be flawed.
It's like we got to be detectives or something, trying to piece together all these little bits and pieces.
It's just kind of like that, yeah.
But instead of, fingerprints and DNA and all that, what we're looking at is memories, people's motivations, and yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely some political maneuvering going on here.
Exactly. And like a good detective, we've got to be looking for those inconsistencies.
Right.
We have to think about how credible each source is, what their motivations might be, and at the end of the day, we've got to draw our own conclusions based on what we know.
Which is tough, right? So I'm curious, as we're going through all of this, what's really standing out to you? What's your biggest takeaway?
For me, this whole situation really points to how important critical thinking skills are, especially these days.
With all the information coming at us all the time, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. We're constantly being bombarded with all these competing narratives, all these different sides of the story, and it's easy to get caught up in the emotion of it all. But this is a perfect example of why we have to take a step back, ask the hard questions, don't just accept things at face value, especially when they seem a little too good to be true or, maybe a little too crazy to believe.
It's a good point. I mean, it's a good reminder that things aren't always what they seem. And this isn't just about politics or elections. Even in our own lives, when we're reading a news story or just talking to a friend, being able to think critically about the information we're taking in, that's crucial. What do you think?
Absolutely. Don't just assume everything you hear is the whole story. Dig a little deeper, look at things from different angles, and don't be afraid to question what you hear. Because in the end, being an informed citizen, being able to make good decisions, it helps all of us.
Couldn't agree more. So on that note, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. If a story like this, something that seems so straightforward at first, can get this messy, this complicated, what does that tell us about how important it is to be media literate, to really think critically about the information we encounter every single day?
It's a great question for everyone to consider.
It is, and it's something we all have to keep working at.
It's an ongoing process, for sure.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And to our listeners, until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.